Professor John Bewaji, our distinguished speaker tonight. PVC Professor Unholy, Dr. Bell, we're glad to see you tonight. Welcome. Dr. Tennyson Joseph, colleagues in the Department of History and Philosophy, ladies and gentlemen, a pleasant good night. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the 3Ws Pavilion at the University of West Indies Cape Hill campus. Every year since 2005, the Department of History and Philosophy has been hosting the Cape Hill Philosophy Symposium, or CHIPS as it is called. We are now in the 13th year of the hosting of this conference, bringing participants from several continents and regions to this campus to debate, discuss, and have conversations on issues germane to the discipline of philosophy. At Cape Hill, we seek to make philosophy the driving force in every discipline, whether it is business, whether it is medicine, whether it is law, or environmental science. As the world grapples with various issues regarding corruption, crime, deviance, and disorder, we believe that philosophy must play a role in our future development. This 13th CHIPS meeting occurs at a time when the University of the West Indies is celebrating its 70th anniversary with the theme, 70 years of leadership, 70 years of service. We sincerely hope that you will find time this weekend to celebrate with us as the university holds its gala dinner under the graduation tent. It is called Dining with the Stars. And its heritage bus tour on Tuesday, May the 1st. So we invite you all to both these events. But we are delighted as a department to have again the public lecture as an integral part of the Cape Hill Philosophy Symposium. And we extend a warm welcome to Professor John Bewaji of the Mona campus of the University of the West Indies. We eagerly await his lecture on the topic Unholy Alliance, Africa and Marxism. I now invite Professor Ocean to introduce our distinguished speaker tonight.
I'll try and be very, very quick. It's a lot to read, but I'll summarize it. Now, amongst Professor Bewaji's academic qualifications include a Bachelor of Arts honors degree obtained in 1979 and a Master's of Arts degree obtained in 1983, both degrees in philosophy from the University of Ife, now Obafemi Awolowo University in Nigeria. He has a PhD in philosophy obtained in 1991 from the premier Nigeria University of Ibadan. He also has a certificate in philosophy for children from Institute of the Advancement of Philosophy for Children, Montclair State College, New Jersey, US. He also holds a Master of Arts degree in distance education obtained in 2007, as well as a postgraduate diploma in distance education, 2003. Now, Bewaji is a former Rhodes visiting lecturer, 1991-1992, in philosophy at the Faculty of Arts, UWI Mona, and joined the staff thereafter in 1992. And he's been there since then. Now, prior to joining the staff at Mona, he was a lecturer in philosophy in the Department of Philosophy at Ogun State University, now Olabisi Onabanjo University in Nigeria, from 1984 to 1991, as well as he was a lecturer at University of Ife, Nigeria, from 1980 to 1984, which means that he has been teaching at the university for close to 40 years now, though he doesn't look it. Now, Professor Bewaji has a distinguished record of original work. His main areas of research and publication focus are on aesthetics, epistemology, philosophy of culture, philosophy of leadership, African and African diaspora thought and philosophy, especially the fundamental African responses to social and moral questions. His book publications include, though not limited to, Media Theory, Practice and Ethics, published in 2017, The Humanities and the Dynamics of African Culture in the 21st Century, published in 2017, The Rule of Law and Governance in Indigenous Yoruba Society, published in 2016, Introduction to Philosophy and Logic, published in 2014, Ontolized Ethics, New Essays in African Meta-Ethics in 2014, Black Aesthetics in 2013. Now, two of his books are seminal, and these are The Beauty of Culture in 2003 and An Introduction to Theory of Knowledge in 2007. Now, Beauty and Culture was his first full-length major book contribution to the area of philosophy of art and aesthetics by an African philosopher, boldly taking on the tradition of leaving the assessment and discussion of African and diaspora art and aesthetic experience to Euro-American intellectuals with scant understanding of the sensitivities and sensibilities that undergird the art of Africa and diaspora, which they were commenting on. Now, in this respect, Professor Bewaji's work on beauty and culture has established him as one of the dominant thinkers on these issues in the African world. And his Introduction to Theory of Knowledge, 2007, a groundbreaking volume, demonstrates that he is equally at home with African and Western ideas of knowledge, as it is amongst the first original effort by an African philosopher to philosophize knowledge from an African perspective, thereby, in many ways, making contributions to knowledge, research, analysis, and interpretation of facts, ideas, and synthesis of issues in epistemology and philosophy of science. Professor Bewaji has over 50 research papers published in peer-reviewed, internationally recognized journals and books. He is also the editor of Caribbean Journal of Philosophy, a consulting editor and advisor on many international journals of philosophy, is also a member of UNESCO National Bioethics Committee of Jamaica and a member of the International Advisory Board on Culture, St. Petersburg, Russia. Ladies and gentlemen, please let's welcome the man of the night, Professor Bewaji.
Good evening, everyone. I hope I was asking the chief, well, that's what we call him, if he doesn't mind me not being a preacher, if I could sit down. And he said that the tradition is to make it as informal as possible. And since the chief has permitted me to sit down, I hope your distinguished member of the audience, you wouldn't mind if I sit down. It's not arrogance on my part. It's just that I felt since it's a family affair, there might be no need to mount the rostrum or the pulpit, you know. So is that okay? Yeah. All right, thank you very much. The chief didn't mention that I was conscripted into this role the very last minute. And I did feel that probably it wasn't such a bad idea, because what it did was to make me do what I had been trying to do for a long time, which just didn't come together the way I would have loved it to come together. And therefore, I'll just give a brief background of what I call the Unholy Alliance. Sometime about 1983, a very highly respected Marxist colleague of mine, who we were both lecturing at the University of Ife, now Obafemi Awolowo University in Ile-Ife, Nigeria, wrote a very short paper. The title of the paper is, "Why Should I Sell My Labor Power?" Why should I sell my labor power? When I read the paper, I reacted, well, as a Marxist, all of you would probably be familiar with Marxist theory and how the ideas go. And in my very short reaction, I said to him that the paper was predicated on the Marxist concept of disempowerment of the worker, which looked at such issues as alienation of the worker from the labor, the worker defined in terms of someone hired to another in an unequal relationship between the employer and the employed. And it was a relationship built on some distrust, because the worker, for the employer to make profit, there must be an element of what is done that is not remunerated. This was the typical relationship between the bourgeois and the proletariat, which Marxism is about. So I said in my little response that what this does is to react on 3 levels. First and foremost, I suggested to him that the idea that labor is evil, that work is evil, is a myth. It's a myth that was constructed. Those of us who are familiar with the Judeo-Christian tradition of what we have in the Old Testament, how Adam and Eve sinned, and consequently they were cursed, and that it was through the labor of their brows that they were going to eat, which then suggested that labor was something that came as a consequence of the great fall. I suggested that that's a myth. People were trying to understand why we have to labor so much, and that they then made labor into an evil thing. My view of that is to say that if labor was evil, if manna fell from heaven, then what do you call picking up manna? Isn't that labor? And if you have to pick up manna, put it in your mouth, masticate, and then swallow, by definition, when I was taught physics, labor is effort, any form of effort at all. Therefore, to say that labor is evil, was just some people trying to understand a phenomenon. And in understanding the phenomenon, they created that narrative. Then I also suggest that if you say that labor is evil, how do people survive? Well, those of us who are Christians and are dreaming of going to heaven, where the city is made of gold, and you are going to be drinking milk and honey, probably farting up the whole place, you must need some sanitary engineers. It's either angels are going to be the slaves, or something has to give, one way or the other. So I suggested that the lamentation of labor arose because of capitalism, which is what Marx was dealing with. And then thirdly, I suggested that societies that had what you call the alienation of labor from the laborer, the unjust arrangement, it doesn't mean that all societies worked like that. And if all societies did not work like that, then the suggestion that Marxism applies universally would become problematic. So I gave him the paper, my reaction, just about 5 or so pages, and I believe that he looked at it and he tried to respond to it, but I never got a very good response. And that was 1983. But my mind was constantly working on Marxism to see how much of Marxism would really apply to the African predicament. And many of us are familiar with David Ricardo in economics, as well as Adam Smith. The ideas of these gentlemen in Western scholarship, they are well celebrated. And my view of that, I actually came from a background of economics into philosophy. So I studied a lot of those theories. And one of my views about it is that probably part of the reason why society is the way it is because some people contrive to be able to solve problems for the rest of us, whereas they forget that we are dealing with human beings. And since social science is what it is, it seems to fail, because of that gap between reality and the theories that are propounded. So, in this discussion then, I'm going to try as much as possible to find a response to why Marxism, when it is applied within the Afrikaner context, simply fails. So, in short, you can say that my discussion is about arguing that the circumstances which led to Marxism, which led to Karl Marx, Das Kapital, and the Communist Manifesto is totally different from the indigenous African environments, and I'm going to illustrate with a number of reasons why it is different, and why, when our colleagues, the Marxists, now try to whip up the masses of the people just simply can't relate to what they're talking about because it is not the circumstances of their existence that is the basis of their effort. And therefore, there is no connection between both of them. So it was not an accident that the historical epochs of agrarian and industrial revolutions overlapped in Europe. But often not mentioned is what gave impetus to the emergence of both as a novel phenomenon in Europe, whereas in other climes, notably in Africa and Asia, the use of various technological tools and the development of urbanization had always been a feature of civilized human existence. What led to the development of industrial and agrarian revolutions was the foraging of Europe into other climes to pillage and plunder the resources of other societies and peoples, to derive excess material resources and unearned income, to contrive the dispossession of the poor among them of their inheritance to land. Anecdotally, at times I joke about it, I said, if God created land, God has stopped creating land. What is available is what we have to kill each other over. And, land is a basic item of necessity. Some part of the land are habitable, some are not. They can be inhabited with a lot of effort, but some are more conducive to existence than, other land. Even when we do reclamation, you still find that whatever is reclaimed is usually susceptible to going back to what it always was. And that is part of the reason why the global warming thing is very important. Now, just last year, I participated at the World Humanities Symposium in Liege, Belgium, and my contribution was to say that homegrown narratives are very essential. In other words, as the Igbo proverb would say, if the lion were to recount the hunt, what happened between himself and the elephant and the hunter, definitely he will paint a picture showing that he was the victim and the hunter was the villain. If you don't tell your story from your own perspective, somebody is going to tell it for you. And you cannot complain that the story that is being told is not yours. So what I'm trying to do is then to look at Marxism within the context of the narrative of what you call global history, and that is political economy, to see why it is difficult. So whenever the idea enters, any idea, whenever it gets to Europe, you find that that ideas then become European invention. Okay? Whether it is, you remember what the Bible did say. By the time the 10 children of Jacob went to Egypt, they already had the wheel, they already had chariots. The Nile was already tamed. The Nile, was already being used. And if you look at the genealogy that you find in the book of John, I'm not saying literally that the Bible is history, but those of us who can relate to that sort of account, the genealogy says that there are, 4 main 14 generations. If we are generous and we give each generation 100 years, that means 14 times 4, which will give us roughly, maybe 500 and something years, 1,000 years. But that is to the time of Christ. But pyramids had been constructed in Egypt, in the Nile Valley, and all over Africa, more than 9,000 years before Christ, which means that this thing about technology is not a new invention. And at that time, they had no cranes, they had, they didn't have all the scaffolds and the various other things that we use now. I'm just trying to suggest that if you begin to examine how any idea which Europe claims to be a fundamental new invention, like the agrarian revolution and the industrial revolution, you find that other societies, if the trajectory of their history had not been truncated, were way more advanced. You could relate that to what is known as the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages was somewhere, about the 7th century to the 12th century or thereabout. And all of a sudden, you now find that when Europe finally began to travel out, Then you have the scientific, the industrial, the agrarian revolution. Okay? People always tend to forget that the same pyramids that you have in the Nile Valley, you had exact replicas of them in the Aztec country, which means that, the so-called New World, this part of the world, was not new. Okay? Africans had traded with the Americas long before Columbus got lost and landed in what they now thought is West Indies. All right? So what I'm trying to suggest then is that when you look at the industrial and the agrarian revolution and how it happened around a particular time, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th century, and you relate it, which is what is usually not done by historians. I mean, you relate it to the plantations where Europe derived most of the wealth that led to the agrarian and the industrial revolution, then you'll be able to see that it was not an accident that the industrial or the agrarian revolution happened, when it did. And some of the argument that is often made, which I believe is very relevant to what we are doing, is that when Europe stumbled on the Americas and started the plantation system, they first brought people from Europe after, destroying the local population. They brought people from Europe. But these people had no knowledge of tropical agriculture or the kind of agriculture you could have here. So they had to go to Africa to find the people who were already agriculturalists, who already knew all the domestication and everything that you're talking about, who were then imported and then enslaved, and the wealth that was generated was what then fueled what is known as the Enclosure Act. The Enclosure Act in the UK was the system that was used, to take the land from the peasants, the poor. And since cities were now emerging, there was need now to feed and to do everything. They then used those laws using the wealth that was derived from, plantation America and trading with Africa and Asia. They then used that to fuel what is the agrarian revolution. But the side of that, which I want to emphasize, is when Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, advocated the laissez-faire system, where it is the invisible hand of demand and supply that determine this. What that did not explain is the inequality. When you have what is known as the three main elements of production, factors of production: land, labor, capital. What was not explained was how the capital was derived and whose land was now appropriated, okay? And how labor now became a commodity. Because labor became a commodity because you already dispossessed the masses of the people, the various things that they were doing to survive. They then became like migrants, who go to the city for one reason or the other, which then created the condition which Karl Marx lamented. So what I'm suggesting there is that the reason why Karl Marx was disgusted by the condition of existence of the masses of the people. But he did not explain, he did not link it up to the Enclosure Act. The Enclosure Act, I consider to be very significant to the agrarian revolution. It is what led to, the system whereby these old estates that constitute the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, would then now belong to a single individual, And everybody, it's the same thing that happened in South Africa, where you now have the Bantustan homelands, where, it's like what happens in contemporary Western society. You have the little oasis of wealth and splendor, and then you have the satellite, where the labor is provided. That was the problem. And then you also had children. Now people talk about child labor. Child labor was part of what developed industrial Europe. When the industries were being built, a lot of the people who worked there were, little children and women. And consequently, the agrarian and industrial revolution marked a time in Europe which then enabled the population to grow beyond a certain level. Because every time the European population was growing, it reaches a point where the food supply and the health supply and everything couldn't sustain it. But now that you had people feeding from outside, that is resources coming from outside, the population of Britain actually virtually doubled within 10 years. Okay? And that I consider to be very significant. As somebody who is interested in Marxism and who finds it very alluring, I just need to be able to understand why it never resonated with the masses of the African population. So what the agrarian revolution were then products of American plantation system. And because they were a product of American plantation system, don't forget also you had Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Rousseau, who were advocating what they called, libertarian, the whole thing, the concept of freedom, and that all human beings are equal, and all the fanciful ideas about the state of nature. They were also advocates of capitalism. It's a way of keeping, things the way they were, just to say, oh, we are all now equal. All of us have agreed to do this, therefore you bought into it. Okay, and since you bought into it, don't complain because this is serving you. Your freedom is now being protected because we now have a system of what is called democracy. And we all see what democracy has become in the world. It's a white elephant, very expensive, and it doesn't really address the interest of the poor. But they will tell you that, oh, we have nothing better than that. That's, we just have to live with it. As if other societies never evolved systems of governance that were humane and democratic before this monster, that we now have. But that's not that's something for another day. I'm just suggesting that those who took seriously the idea of freedom were the same ones who were enslaving other people in the Americas. And when the people of Haiti decided that they were having none of it, and Jamaicans and everywhere, people revolted, and they were suppressed very brutally. Okay? The case of Haiti is about the only society in the world where the victor became the vanquished. Because everybody ganged up against Haiti, and they have not been able to break out of it. And people wonder, why is Haiti so poor? Haiti is poor because they refuse to be cowed, they refuse to be subjected. And when they beat all the world powers, they were then forced to sign a contract where all the resources were extracted. And, currently, if you look at it very carefully, IMF, World Bank, WTO, they are all instruments for the extraction of resources from the poor. That's just what they are. Okay? So, let me go on to my, so that I don't take too much of your time, because we'll have, so when Karl Marx now witnessed some of the things that were taking place, he was totally disgusted, and he felt that there must be a better way. But the better way that he advocated is for the reclamation, a reconnection between labor power and the laborer. But then, if the laborer is to own his effort, it's not going to happen. The bourgeois is not just going to be generous and say, yeah, you are free now. Let's sit down and negotiate how much your labor is worth, and then I'll pay you exactly that amount. If the bourgeois did that, the profit that he's able to make is going to be diminished. Okay? And if the profit diminishes, it means that automatically he's not going to be as wealthy, as he used to be. And if he's not going to be as wealthy, since there is unequal power play here, there has to be a way of keeping the laborer at marginal pay. And if the marginal pay is able to keep your body and soul together, then you should be grateful, because, as many people did argue, the condition in which Africans lived in Africa was worse than the slavery. Some people make that argument. So people who were enslaved should be grateful that they were brought here. The same thing, the laborer should be happy. Don't forget, the laborer's land that belonged to his ancestors was already, through the Enclosure Act, was already taken from him. And now he has to go on the factory site or on the farm to now work. It's like when the emancipation took place, and you say, oh, the slaves are now free to go. But they were never paid for the work they had done. They were never given any land. The plantation owners were paid handsomely for freeing their slaves. So what then happened was, if Jamaica, for example, had a land bridge between Jamaica and Africa, most people would have trekked. It wouldn't have mattered how many days or months or years it took to get back to Africa. But you say, oh, you are free now, you can go. But the sea is there. You don't provide a means of transport for them to go back. Many of them had to now contract themselves back to their masters, former masters, at conditions that were probably worse than when they were not being paid. So, what Karl Marx then suggested is that this condition cannot be sustained. And he was then advocating that the masses of the world should come together and revolt. But then you know that the poor, in many instances, have no organizational capacity. And that is where the lumpen, proletariat will come in, the enlightened among them. And if the enlightened among them happen to be intelligentsia like, many of my colleagues, they are easily co-opted. They are easily bought, okay? All you do is just dangle a little, thing in front of some of them, and before you know it, they are singing a totally different tune. So the issue then is, based on my understanding of Marxism, Marxism addressed a peculiar problem in Europe at a particular point in time, and that related to the condition under which the masses of the people lived, okay? And if that was the situation, it made sense. Actually enlightened self-interest, because Karl Marx himself was not from a very poor background. He was from a background where he had all the advantages. So he understood what was happening, and that human beings would not like to continue in that kind of environment. So his philosophy then was to address those circumstances which made human beings into commodities, their labor into commodities that were bought and sold, but in which they had no power in dictating how much to be paid for their effort. So when my colleagues now in Africa, Marxists, now jump on the bandwagon, I say they need to step back and understand the differences between the European climate, which led to Marxism, and the African condition, which they are now trying to sell, the idea of this world, workers to unite. Because people can unite, but they need to understand what it is they're uniting around. In other words, they need to understand what is common to them. What is common may not really be common, because unless you understand the differences, you might be talking about the same thing but saying different things. So my suggestion is that what we now create is a theory without proper understanding of the background to what they're talking about. The first thing that I look at here is land. And in order to understand the nature of land ownership in Africa, let me cite Jack Goody. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Jack Goody. Jack Goody was one of the top anthropologists, historians in one of the big league universities in UK. When he was trying to understand the socio-political economy of Africa, and he was trying to rationalize why in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, and in various other countries of that region, why African land was justly taken by the whites, is because in Africa nobody owned the land. The land ownership was totally different. Let us say we all belong to the same extended family, and we have the whole of Uwe Cave Hill as our land, ancestral land. Any one of us could go anywhere there to farm. Okay? You could even plant cash crop like coconut, like palm trees, because the land belongs to all of us. And if someone comes from a different family or a different part of the world and needed land, we just say, okay, you look at that palm tree there, look at the other one there. Just, continue farming. But don't plant any cash crop. Anything that is going to take longer than 5 years to reap, you can't plant it on borrowed land. Because the moment you do that, it's like you are now appropriating it. Now, if you come to the elder, you come to chief and say, Chief, I hear that all this land belongs to you. Where is your land title? The man look at you and wonder, how does anybody have a title to land? Because it's insane. You met the land there, your ancestors met it there, it belongs to you. You want to build, you want to farm, you want to do anything, you are free. Those migrants who come in, when they farm on your land, they give a token, okay? A token like rent. But it's not like they are selling. So you cannot buy or sell land. You can't sell what belongs to everybody. So because these people had no title to the land, the idea of the European guy who just emerged in the 17th, the 18th century, where the Enclosure Act means you must have a title, is that since these Africans had no title to the land, they can take it. And that was how the best arable part of the land in South Africa, in Rhodesia, all of those places were taken over. And the poor people were driven away, who now became like tenants on their own ancestral land. And when the Zimbabwe problem started, and people were castigating Mugabe, I said to them, did anybody hear Thabo Mbeki say a single word against Robert Mugabe? Absolutely not. Because why? The problem in Zimbabwe is the problem of South Africa, and the matter has to be addressed. And the new president is trying to address it, and I will not be surprised if one way or the other something doesn't happen to him. He might suddenly develop a kind of cancer nobody ever heard about, like our friend Hugo Chavez. So land is something you don't trade in. in many African societies. When my father went to join the ancestors, I told my other brothers, I said, you see, Baba has gone. The land he left, anybody could go there. He actually had people coming, migrants from other people, I would say, and farm there. Just ensure you protect that legacy. Don't sell any portion of it. If you want to sell any portion of it, just call me. I'm ready to buy you out. Okay? It's not, I don't, I'm just saying that the condition of land in Africa is totally different from that in Europe. That's number one. Number two, labor. Labor is not a commodity that you can quantify and that you can buy and sell. Okay? But because, population growth, city life, and so on and so forth, the factory life, the plantation, and all those, it now means that people now buy and sell labor. And I ask, those cities, those civilizations, where people did not buy or sell labor, how did they develop? And the simple reason for that is that those traditional societies had structures whereby labor was pooled to do important work, and everybody contributed to the best of their ability. Let me explain. Let us say the three of us are friends, and we are farmers. You grow cotton, he has, cocoa, plantation, I plant yam. When the time comes to cultivate the land, the three of us will come together and bring other friends. All of us will go to the farm and do the work. All that chief has to provide, if we are working on his farm, is plenty food. And when we finish, he will get nice, good Demerara beer or Ray and Nephew or whatever, and everybody sit down and and we go. You still find that in Jamaica and in many of our Caribbean societies. It's called partner. Okay? It has transitioned into what you call partner. When you look at VMBS, it's a different form of partnership. The building societies. Okay? It's a way of getting out of the clutches of banking as it is. And you find that in Islam is revolted by the idea of charging interest. Interest is called usury, and it is called haram. It's a sin. Let me explain. If you were good enough, why would you need to borrow? And if you came to borrow, why should I charge you interest, which is to make your life worse? I don't know if you get what I'm... These are the basic elements of capitalism, which Marx was complaining about. And you find that, in many of our countries in the Caribbean, people have been dispossessed of the little land they had when they go to somebody to borrow a little bit of money. The person will lend you that money, and he will say, okay, don't worry. All you have to do is give me the title to your land as security. And he will encourage you to default. When you have defaulted for a number of years, and then you come and say, you want your title back, he will look at you and say, what do you mean? You haven't paid. Therefore, it takes over the land. And that way, some people have been able to acquire, a lot of land in the community. And it's absolute, disgrace. So, when you look at the structure of the land system then, and you look at the labor, the system was totally different. What Karl Marx witnessed in Europe was very different from what happened in Africa. Then if you look at what is known as urbanization and poverty, what you call the ghettos and the garrisons and the so-called neighborhoods, upscale, uptown, downtown. That's not the kind of life that is common in Africa. You might be very, very rich, and you build this entire building and you and your family live there. I might be very, very humble, and the only thing I call my house is just 10 by 10, and I have it next to you. Okay? You can't run me out of my property. You cannot say that devalues your own property. When the Europeans came to Africa and they set up what they call GRAs, government residential areas, and the DO would live in the higher part of the town, all of those disappeared as soon as colonialism, was over. And the reason for that is that the kinds of segregation of the living quarters for the rich and the poor, and then you have the satellites to the wealthy communities of people who are merely, servants, cleaners, and this and that. That never existed. Actually, it would have been regarded as a disgrace for you to now, because you become rich, to now go and build your house in a secluded area. It's only lepers who live away from others. I don't know if you get what I'm saying. Actually, it means you are sick. For you now to be living in this place that is inaccessible, and then you fence yourself around. All right? But you see, because of the psychology of property, and what transpired with the agrarian and the feudalism in Europe and the agrarian and industrial revolution, people now they could even build their golf courses in their own property, which nobody goes there. So I'm trying to suggest that the distinction between residential areas for the rich and the poor also was problematic. Because in Lagos, in Ibadan, in most of the cities in Africa, when those things were built by the colonial masters, in many instances, as soon as they are gone, you find that, the equation changes. And if the equation changes, it means that people don't see themselves, that their poverty was a reason for them to be disgraced. And therefore, they never lost sight of their own dignity. Okay? And the last point that I make along those lines is that when you look at the conditions which Karl Marx tried to use to show that capitalism has built in it its own elements of destruction, and that the masses of the people must come together to liberate themselves. It was a consequence of certain circumstances in Europe of the time. And those circumstances did not exist, or if it existed, it was not of the same kind. And therefore, when African Marxists are trying to use Karl Marx, it becomes a problem. If you look at the examples of Julius Nyerere and Kwame Nkrumah, you will find that in the case of Nyerere, it was a conspiracy of the West that actually made his experiment to be doomed. I mean, anybody who looks at what has happened in Cuba over so many generations will understand exactly what I'm talking about. In Nigeria, we never tried anything near what Nyerere did. The persons who could have done well for the country, one way or the other, they were marginalized or killed or, one way or the other destroyed. In the case of Nyerere, he made sure that the school calendar actually fitted the climate, okay? So that you don't have children being idle. When they are not in school, they are on the farms with their parents, okay? And consequently, I mean, I'm now told that the bulldozer, isn't that what they call the new president of Tanzania? That is trying to reenact and to destroy all the vestiges of corruption. Okay? And that is very significant. And therefore, when African Marxists begin their theorizing and this and that, it is misguided. It is misguided because they fail to understand, the historical circumstances of the people. That is totally different. And if it is different, it means you are not speaking to their life situation. And therefore, when you ask them to do something, they can't do it because, you are trying to superimpose a superstructure on a different type of infrastructure. So I call this the failure of Marxism and misguided revolutionary struggle in Africa. And I say the above shows the fault lines of unguided Marxism, because when Marxist scholars and revolutionaries lament the failure of their efforts, what they did not realize is the fact that there is something totally dissonant in what they are doing. One of them actually did say, the decadence of the ruling classes was based essentially on their focus on using power for individual profit, thereby setting the process for development of mega corruption. The revolutionary part has not worked because of the difficulties of establishing an effective vanguard party to galvanize the struggle and create traction for change. The revolutionaries who decided to take the shortcut of joining the bourgeois politics ended up as turncoats, being co-opted and betrayed their ideals. So the problem was not the fact that the masses did not need or want better governance systems. The problem was that the Marxists misunderstood the historical foundations of African socio-economic and cultural realities, which did not allow for tyranny in their indigenous systems. And where such tyrannies existed, there were clear ways of dealing with them. The gentleman who just passed a couple weeks back, Akinwumi Ishola, wrote a play. It's a historical play. There was this powerful woman. The name is Efun Shetan Anibura Iyalode Ibadan. She was very tyrannical. She had power, okay? Over, she led, she was able to use male and female to work and all that. But she was also indecent in the way she treated with the dignity of the human beings who worked for her. And you know what the people did? They subverted the system until she had to pay with her life. And that is, when people talk about dictatorship and kingship or obaship and all those things, they make it seem as if this thing you call democracy is such a big deal. But they didn't understand, because they don't understand the governance systems in many African societies before colonialism. When the Europeans got to Abeokuta in Nigeria, they found a system and a structure that was way superior to anything in any part of Europe. And the records are there. Okay? So the issue then is, how do you make the transition? How do you begin the process of helping people to understand that because you saw an idea somewhere and it is working there, it doesn't mean you can just lift it and then plant it in a different environment. If you try it, it becomes a problem. I mean, many of our architects, I use that as an example. You see the buildings that they bring around, you build in a tropical environment and there is no cross flow of air, there is no cross ventilation, and then you now need to be air conditioning and all that. And then you ask yourself, what is wrong with us? what exactly is wrong with us. What is wrong with us is what is wrong with Marxists, that is, African Marxists. Their incapacity to understand where they are coming from and where they want to go, and that is what I call the Unholy Alliance. Thank you.
Right, I think that was quite interesting, if not provocative. I'll invite questions for Professor Bewaji, or comments.
Your very interesting discussion about technology and development in Africa before European, thousands of years, millennia before European colonization. The African Marxism, Amilcar Cabral had spoken about that. I mean, just like you, he was suggesting that Marx had claimed that it is class struggle as the motive force of history. And based on his knowledge of Africa's past, its technological past, he was saying, no, let's say instead that the level of the development of the productive forces. So what you described, what you suggested about taking, the thing was written for Europe, but you can apply it to Africa. Cabral did that in a very effective way. My question to you about the before and after, though, what I really want to say to you is, everything you described had been captured in Marx's notion of primitive communalism. Mm-hmm. So what you were describing about the absence of classes, the absence of exploitation, is true in his own racist mind. He called it the Asiatic mode of production and so forth. But he did capture it. So everything you said there about Africa was different and so forth. Marx understood that because he referred to this big category which he called primitive communism and so forth. Mm-hmm. But the after, the point I'm making to you, I agree with you, can apply Marx wholesale, but the after colonialism and after Africa's indigenous production systems and indigenous social relations is brought into the capitalist frame, then by your own argument, then it applies. So to suggest that it's written for Europe and has no application, I'm suggesting to you, everything you said was correct. But once African systems are brought into the capitalist mode of production, or capitalism, then Marx's critique has some applicability. That's really what I want to suggest.
Yes, I do, agree with that. What I'm suggesting is that we don't have to contrive a capitalist structure in order to then apply. We don't have to first go, the class struggle in order for us now to have Marxist application. What I'm suggesting is that we need to be sensitive to the fact that those class structures happened in history in Europe for a particular reason. That's the agrarian industrial revolution. We don't need to create that, in order to do what is necessary. And I'm suggesting to my Marxist colleagues that in many African societies, the mechanisms and the mechanics for control of any form of human inhumanity to other human beings was already part of the indigenous systems. So indeed, Cabral and others, and even Marx, as you suggested, was aware of what happened before agrarian and industrial revolution and the capitalism that, took over. But what I'm trying to understand, which I also think that you agree with, is the fact that many of our colleagues within the Marxist axis wonder why it is that the masses that we are trying to champion don't recognize that we are there for them. The reason is the class struggle is not there, it's not part of their life. When people say in Nigeria, for example, that you have so much resources, and some people just take everything and nobody is saying anything. I mean, as a lecturer, I had plenty of land. I wasn't buying anything. When salaries were not paid, it wasn't my headache. So I survived because I had, means of surviving. It's not like when you are now told you are an emancipated slave, you are no longer a slave, but you have no land. You have nothing. Yes, you are free, but what is your freedom worth? Which means you have to now go back to your erstwhile master and then reach some form of agreement, which is never a good deal. So that's the kind of thing that I'm suggesting. I have absolutely nothing against Marxism. I think for what it did within history, it was fundamental. I'm just saying that the application by my colleagues, like Segun Oshoba, like Biodun Jeifo, and others, these are good scholars. However, I'm suggesting that they fail to be cognizant of those tiny little details. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Nigel Newton, I find your analysis quite instructive, and I like it very much. Karl Marx dealt with the issue at that time. We, in 2018, we do have issues to deal with because we are dealing with issues of crime and violence, low self-esteem, all of that. How can we move forward? Or what type of analysis and how can we really move forward from or get away from the level of crime and violence that we are seeing in our community? Because what you did is to remind me of some of the issues that I had to deal with and I'm dealing with now. In fact, at the moment, I am a candidate for elections. I am part of the United Progressive Party, and all of those issues that you raised are before me. And what can we do? How can we move forward, or how can we move away from the hopelessness that we are seeing now?
Now this one stumped me.
Analysis and how we can.
Well, from my little experience of living in Jamaica, the fundamental thing, and studies have shown, fortunately we have, Prof. here, Professor Clayton and others who are aware there are very few societies where the leadership, if you have, first and foremost, let's take Jamaica. Jamaica is almost a basket case because children are having children, okay? And everybody recognizes that early childhood education is fundamental because if you don't catch them young and they grow up wild, they have expectations. In the world now, everything is at your fingertips. People see what others, the life patterns of others. It's not everybody who can live like those of us who have no imagination. Some people want to change their shoes virtually every week. Some, cars and all that. My suggestion is that first, the leadership themselves need to define. In those days, when I was younger, our countries used to have what you call 5-year development plans, 10-year development plans, 20-year. When people talk about Vision 2050 or whatever, you look and say, where do you want this society to be? And what are the steps we need to take? In most cases, when you ask those questions, ask your colleagues in the political party, how many of them are asking those questions? Most of them, the only thing they are preoccupied with is how to win the election, not what happens after. So, I'm not a politician, and I tell people that in Jamaica, they've left me alone now. Because in the past, every year they will invite me to their annual jamboree, which they usually have at the National Arena. And I tell people I can't show my face in any of the two parties because I don't want anybody to box me into any group. That way I can speak my mind. I can tell anybody what I think about them. So the issue is, what is the aim of you going into politics? Because I see them as parasites. It's a parasitic system. Whereas in those days, our leaders knew that they were holding the position in trust for the living and those who have gone beyond and those who are coming after us. Now, it's all about self-gratification. And young people are not fools. Because, just recently they changed, the cabinet was reshuffled. You know that one minister spent close to 9 million on telephone bills. The 9 million could have paid the salary of at least, the salary of a fresh graduate in Nigeria is less than 1 million. Which means at least 10 people for 1 year. In other societies, the guy would have been fired. But it didn't happen. They just reshuffled. And they think the poor people who are paying the taxes don't know. And therefore, people don't want to pay taxes if they can get away with it. So, you can't be asking people for trust and support when you, the leader, behaves in a certain way. When they see that you, as an individual, that your life is not a good example, people are also going to try well and do whatever little thing they can. So I don't know what to say to you. I don't know how you solve the problem. But I said the country, Barbados, has a population of probably 1.2 million. Less? Huh? 280? Oh, I was thinking of Trinidad. Sorry about that. Yeah, because 280,000. So this country is really not poor. If only things can be organized with decency. You see, when I say something about cities and ghettos and all those things, it is a disgrace for me personally to see any member of my family in destitution. It is a disgrace. And that is still here in the West Indies because can you imagine people go to live in Canada where they have to dig themselves out like rabbits under snow and go to work, and they still send remittances to their friends to sit at 6 a.m. and drink Dragon or Guinness? But people have to be responsible. People have to be responsible. Some people, just have no business. It's everybody for themselves. I call it individualism or this idea of individualism is a disgrace. That was the paper I wrote many years ago about the social contract theory. When people talk about the state of nature, human beings never lived in a state of nature. It wasn't just possible. The human infant is one of the most vulnerable animals. Could not survive without care. Couldn't survive. Ants will eat up your baby, if you leave it without care. A chick, the day it is hatched, can peck and go. Most other animals are like that, but the human infant, many of our children are still living at home even in their 30s and 40s. So when people talk about the state of nature, there was nothing like that. It couldn't be human beings. Human beings have always been in communities. And you know the reason? When a woman is pregnant, a time comes when it's virtually debilitated and incapacitated without care. Huh? Wild animals would have eaten up both the mother and the child. Therefore, human beings have always had that self-preservation. But that self-preservation, which is called enlightened self-interest, is what the rich have now totally forgotten. And that is what is driving the crime and violence. Because some people are taking virtually everything. You are cooking, now it has got to a stage where people are cooking in the yard, and you turn around to go and fetch water, and before you come, your pot of cooking is gone. Yeah. And then you go next door, and then you see somebody eating with their family because they haven't eaten for days. Why should it be like that? Somebody driving around a vehicle in Jamaica worth more than 20 million, and somebody that doesn't have ordinary slippers to wear, and then you ask there will be no violence?
Thank you, Professor, for the contribution tonight. There's a recent film that came out that would be very popular among many black people across the world, Black Panther. And while some of us are aware of many of the things that it was implying, there's an underlying question and message that asks Africa, why did it not do more in relation to the defense of itself and also the defense of those who were forced into the diaspora? In other words, almost to the extent of whether there's a betrayal by the lack of response, since it is a myth too as well about the lack of sophistication and development of Africa when Europe met it. So why did Africa not respond? So were the Africans collaborators in the whole thing? And bringing this into your area in terms of the Karl Marx's contribution, as Tennyson said, after the imposition of European colonialism, and then using that as a framework to impose those ideas on Africa. The question is, Africa, with all of its rich history and the complexity, and I would say also the sophistication, and as Jack Diop says, the fact that Marx himself was guilty of a misnomer in his theory of historical materialism, where he calls that the Asiatic mode of production, when it should actually be the African mode of production. But then that is not elaborated. Why did Africa not elaborate it sufficiently? Why did Africa not explain it sufficiently? Why did Africa not challenge the Marxist theory of historical materialism sufficiently, which would not have us going through these kinds of struggles now about why the whole thing went wrong, when you could create a theory of transformation that left out millennia in the development of humankind, and that the very country that you dismissed, the very continent that you dismissed, would be responsible to a tremendous extent in informing how you would transform the globe. How are the Africans going to excuse themselves from that responsibility for letting that slip by?
You see, I think it was 2008, I had presented a paper in Brazil, and the title of the paper is Requiem to Western Education in African Societies. After the presentation, a gentleman asked me, but you know, you are a product of that Western education, why are you disrespecting it? And I said to him that it seems as if you are suggesting that without Western education I couldn't have been here, because my ancestors were already in the Americas before Europeans. And Western education, this thing that we do in this contrived space, is what has created people like me who speak with a forked tongue, a language which my peers in the village don't understand, and who I then regard as uneducated. And therefore, it then gives me a sense that I deserve to be treated in a certain way. It gives me an air of superiority, and so on and so forth. So, what this then suggests to me to address the immediate challenge which you have posed is that many of us, I mean, if you look at Claude Aki, did mention what he calls social science as imperialism. Oko Bitek, discussed what he calls African religions in Western scholarship. Okay? Then Diop and others have helped us to understand a lot about our indigenous African cultural heritage. As I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, when an idea gets into Europe, that idea never existed elsewhere. It is now an invention of Europe for which the rest of humanity must be grateful. And many of us who are now academics and intellectuals, we never do what you are asking us, a proper interrogation to see the validity of the claim to originality. And if you don't do that, then you are not going to be able to do what is needed, which is find alternative structures of progress, of development. And if you can't do that, then the narrative is the one that you have, the orthodoxy that is presented to you. And, from what I get, we need to question how it is that civilizations existed before this modern one, and find, I'm not saying you should discard everything, because societies borrow from each other. What I know is that the trajectory we are on in the world, which China is resisting, there is a problem. If capitalism is so good, why is it you have to spend so much to destroy every other system and to prop up capitalism? Why is it you don't just let everybody just see the beauty of it for itself? So it's a responsibility. In 2012, incidentally, that's the only book that Professor Odiambo didn't mention when he was reading, this citation. I did a book that is called Narratives of Struggle. In Narratives of Struggle, I started with an examination of one of the top scholars of Western anthropology in recent time, Robin Horton. I don't know how many of you have heard about Robin Horton. He was the one who celebrated what he called the open and closed predicament. And he said that African societies had a closed predicament, whereas Europeans had an open predicament, that is a scientific predicament. And he was trying to suggest that the reason why Africa is backward is because we don't interrogate ideas. We are always using spirits. As if Europeans don't use spirits. Okay? What this cell technology that we had, people already knew about it. They were able to communicate at a distance long, long before this. But the question is, we never actually say, yeah, but how was it possible for my ancestor who was in the village to communicate with somebody across the seas? And because we never did that, it means that we lost so much. And I tell people one of my interests, if I still survive, is to go back to the village and learn from some of these babalawos and the rest of them and see exactly how they were able to harness the knowledge, indigenous knowledge systems, just to preserve some of them for posterity. Maybe when we begin to teach them in the school system, then probably life might take on a different thing for us.
In defense of the Marxists, because you suggest that the Marxists, and I assume, and I think you're referring to Nigerian Marxists in particular, have a problem that they're trying to lead, but somehow the masses aren't following, right? You made, and you specifically mentioned two of your former IFE colleagues in the end, Bewaji and Sheikh Shoba, right? But what I want to make a comment and ask a question. The comment is this. You see, you present, you talk about Africa in a kind of static way, so that if you take Nigeria, let's use Nigeria as an example. 19th century Nigeria, the Nigerian space. I mean, even if it what's going on in Yoruba land, since you mentioned Abeokuta, I mean, what's happening in Ibadan is not what is happening in Abeokuta. It's not what is happening in, say, New Oyo, or in among the Ekiti, or among your people, the Jesha. So there's no, like, we can't say in 19th century Nigeria, this is what is happening, and we can apply a specific theory, or we can't. Then, if you look at the ABU school, Ahmadu Bello University, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, which was probably where most of the Marxist scholarship developed. And you look at the work of, say, somebody like Bala Usman. What they're arguing is that we can begin to apply Marxist ideas, because when we look at what's going on, particularly in northern Nigeria, in terms of the development of firstly the Sarauta system, and then the Caliphate system after the jihad, and you're looking at the emergence of capitalism or proto-capitalism in northern Nigeria, to which Marxism may be legitimately applied. And I think in defense of them, and one other example, because you talk about land, and as if land is all the system of land tenure across Africa is always this usufructory system. We have in the Borno area, among the Shua Arabs, among the Kanembu and others, by the time you come to the 19th century, before European colonialism, the development of private property systems. And that's what they're beginning to apply the Marxism to. So what they see as like the changes taking place, admittedly isolated. Not enough to say, oh, we have an entire movement across Nigeria or across northern Nigeria, because I mean, you still had the Middle Belt, for example. So all I'm saying is, in defense of the Marxists, they are looking at changes rather than seeing like Africa in a kind of static, this is the ideal. We're looking at the reality, and that reality in many cases is northern Nigeria. My question is this: how do you assess the work of the Journal of African Marxists? How do you assess that body of scholarship, that body of work that appeared in the Journal of African Marxists?
Actually, the paper which I referenced was by Dipo Fashina, which you probably would be familiar with it. And I think it was published in that journal. Yes. I recognize the work of people like Bala Usman and others of the Zaria School. But what turned out later in his life, and some of them in that category, is that they, I don't know how charitable, which way to put it, because some of the things that came out from that group, like the argument, for example, that the oil that is in the Delta actually came from northern Nigeria through the Niger. They made some which led me to questioning the integrity of the scholarship that they were producing. This is, in order not to personalize discussion, I just try to leave those things aside. Indeed, the northern, well, the reason why Boko Haram, Maitatsine thing, and the current problem we are facing in Nigeria, the Fulani herdsman kind of thing is happening, is simply because it's not a capitalist structure in the typical capitalist way you will put it in Europe, because it was not built around industries, or agrarian kind of thing. The nomadic thing, which was, what the jihad, the Fulani jihad and the caliphate brought about, was consolidating a system of dispossession of the poor and the use of the poor, and it was terrible. So Usman and others were right in that sense. But the challenge that we still face, in the northern Nigeria as well as in southern Nigeria and in other African communities, is not the typical class struggle thing. The class struggle doesn't arise in the north because religion is used to explain the disparity. The idea is to say, well, this is how God has created you. You are the talakawa, you are the poor. You must not covet what the bourgeois has. You must respect them, and then they will give you, is it zakat or something? They will give you, on a regular basis, they will, make provision for you. So it's challenging how to make a transition from that to a contemporary thing. Maybe I could just add, many people have been struggling with the various contraptions that emanated from colonialism. The Berlin Conference dividing Africa, and then putting people from different backgrounds into different countries created all kinds of challenges. For example, if you look at the cultural tradition of some elements of northern Nigeria, you'll find that the idea of planning for a long future was not part of governance system, because the belief is that Allah would provide for tomorrow. So there was no need for you to do all of that. And if you live in that kind of environment, you can see how that kind of society will be a problem for the rest of the country, which is one of the things we have going. Yes?
I'm not sure that is quite accurate.
Okay.
It sounds very much like the southern interpretation of what goes on in the north, which is not necessarily what goes on in the north. So that, like, your analysis about the influence of religion, I'm not going to deny the influence of religion, because it has been abused by, you look, whether it's Gumi, whoever. But I think if you did, let's take Boko Haram, for example, right? The original movement, which appears in Borno around Maiduguri, right, is not a religious movement. Well, it's not a religious movement in the way in which Shekau and others are saying it is. It is largely a protest movement against social and economic deprivation in northeastern Nigeria, not just in Maiduguri or not just in Borno. When you talk about religion and using religion in the north, you go back 50 years or more, and you've had people challenge that. The Sardana wants to create a system where he says, we build one north. Aiki Daidaba, work and worship is our motto. But you also have people like Aminu Kano. Since you talk about Katalakawa, Aminu Kano and Nepu, we're quite clear where the allegiance is like. We're fighting on behalf of the poor, right? Now, I think we have to draw a distinction between, say, academics using Marxism to analyze what has happened, what's going on, and some of those same academics as politicians. We know quite a few of them fail, right? but it may not, and I'm not quite sure that we can say there's no class struggle in Nigeria. To be quite frank, it sounds like a typical Ibadan University statement. That we don't have class struggle in Nigeria. We have class struggle in Nigeria. And we've had it for a very long time. What we're trying to do, and what the Marxists were trying to do, was to simply say, look, these things are here. They may not be on the scale, they may not be to the extent, they may not be to the degree that existed in 19th century Europe or what. But the idea that that people try to dismiss the Marxists and say what they're saying has no relevance to Nigeria is what I always have a problem with.
I haven't dismissed Marxism, you know.
No, I'm saying that we go on as saying, oh, the Marxists can't do this, the Marxists are inappropriate, the Marxists don't understand, the Marxists don't. All I'm saying is there are all sorts of problems in Nigeria, and trying to figure them out will take forever. Basically, that's what people will say. It's not true.
No. You see, I haven't suggested that. All right, simply put, I'm trying to understand why it is the efforts of those people you mentioned, Bala Usman, Aminu Kano, Shegun Oshoba, and the rest of them, why the masses actually don't find the arguments speaking to their conditions. Because the so-called class struggle, there are classes, there are haves and the have-nots. There are the rich and the poor. But it's not a consciousness in which the alienation is the alienation of the laborer from the labor that causes that sense of dehumanization. You could actually link, you know that existentialism is also a philosophy that arose around the same time as Marxism. And both of them were trying to understand this new predicament where human being is more like just a thing instead of being a human being. And if you do that, you know, I'm not saying that in northern Nigeria, what succeeded the caliphate, the jihad, was a horrible, horrible thing. However, as you suggested, you cannot generalize that for Nigeria, not to mention Africa. I'm just trying to understand why it is, my colleagues, why it is that the kind of movement that they wanted, why did it fail? Why didn't they succeed? That's what I'm trying to. I'm not saying that Marxism is not relevant. Yeah.
Good evening. Thank you, Professor, for your intriguing presentation. I just have a very quick question. I just wanted to know how Marxism has actually enabled or enhanced or even promoted women's rights, particularly when we speak about equal pay for equal work. In particular, domestic work, when we look at what is happening in Western culture as opposed to African culture. So in terms of the gendered perspective, I just want to see if you came across any research that can enable or provide some information on that. Thank
you. Remember I had suggested that in many cultures, labor was not something that was bought and sold. But that didn't mean that there was no recognition for the contribution of each person. When Western feminists attempted to generalize feminism, many African thinkers objected. They objected not because there is no unequal, you know, if you like, playing field between the genders in Africa, but they objected because they think you could not just generalize European or American experience and, you know, format it on the rest of humanity. Each society has its different ways of looking at gender issues. One of the significant contributions is from Oyeronke Oyewumi. I don't know if you're familiar with her work. And she used Yoruba, gender relations to indicate that in Yoruba society you have had women war leaders. Also in Hausa, Queen Amina. Okay? And in many instances, when you say the king, in many instances, the king's mother or the first wife who runs things. So, and in Yoruba society also, a research was done recently which showed that in many Yoruba towns and cities, you had a king and you had a queen. But the king is not the husband of the queen. I don't know if you get what I'm saying. The women elect their own queen who presides over matters relating to all aspects of life as far as it concerns women. And the king presides over everything. And when there is need now, when they have a general issue, everybody come together, the king sitting and the queen sitting, and then deliberations. That happened in many Yoruba societies. I don't know how many countries where you have that. But that's what research has shown. And the coronation of both the king and the queen is done differently. It's not, one thing. So what I'm saying is that one of the things that Marxism reacted against was especially the disparity in the labor conditions between male and female and the use of child labor, which was part of the Industrial Revolution. Now we now call it sweatshops, and we now call it child labor, okay? And many companies try to avoid the label because it's not good for their business. But all of these were part of what you can call the regular fare of industrialization. So, in essence, I could say that within the Nigerian educational system, there was no disparity between the pay for female professor or male professor. And I don't know, if that takes place in any other country. I know that the places I've been familiar with, you're paid the same wages. I think that, the Marxists would probably have different take on it. I'm not a Marxist, and I'm not particularly very educated about it, but I'm trying to suggest that, in essence, you will need to understand that when you move from one context to the other, there might be need to, situate things differently.
Okay, Mr. Sawyer, the last one.
Yes, Professor. My understanding of your presentation is that fundamentally you do not see Marxism as an appropriate explanation for Africa, and I'm putting the word Africa in quotation marks. So could you tell us briefly, as my understanding is that fundamentally Marxism has been an attempt to account for unjust, unequal, exploitative human relations. And Marx's answer was, the root of the problem is money, and what is done with money. If you don't agree with Marx, what do you see to be the root of the problem? Because Africa, like everywhere else on planet Earth, is rife with problems.
I wouldn't say just money. I'm thinking rather on the bigger picture, which is the exchange system. The exchange system, whatever you are exchanging would be the issue. At times people talk about trade by barter as primitive. But the way it worked was because of fairness. Fairness in the sense that people recognized what something was worth and they were willing to pay, a fair exchange so that people don't feel as if they have been cheated. What Karl Marx was trying to argue against is the kind of exploitative system that capitalism operates. In other words, when you talk about the invisible hand of supply and demand, and you produce this bottle of water, and you know that everybody needs it, you produce it with $50. And because everybody needs it, you know you can sell it for 100 or 200. Okay? And then you make super profit. Now, they will tell me that, well, since I'm the one producing it, other people should compete. When there is competition, the price could fall. All right? But don't forget that in the exchange system that you are talking about, there are some people who cannot even become producers to be able to compete. And because of the circumstances of their existence, it's not of their own making, it's not that they are lazy. And it's not that they don't want to be part of the system. It's just that the circumstances preclude their capacity to participate on a meaningful scale. All right, let me use a far-fetched example. Now, we say that science, technology, engineering, and all those things, everything is open now. But yet, we turn around and say that some countries are not fit, are not human enough to have nuclear capacity. It's only some. In other words, because you contrive the situation the way you configure it, it means that some people are, they're just kept down. Not because they don't want to be part of it or they can't be part of it, but because of how things are set up. And then you turn around now and then blame them for their poverty. That is problematic. And if you then say, okay, all of you should organize and come together, how are they going to organize and come together in an environment in which they have been disempowered? I don't know if that helps.
I think with that, we'll have to come to a close. As much as I would have wished that we continue, but time is not on our side. Let's all please give Professor Bewaji a round of applause. Especially more so, in fact, I think on behalf of the Department of History and Philosophy, I really want to thank him for his presence. I should have mentioned it earlier, but I was leaving it for the end. Actually, we had a guest speaker earlier in mind, but who only communicated to us a couple of weeks ago that he would not be able to make it, which of course confused the whole organization of CHIPS until our good friend Bewaji said that he could come in, step in and make it a reality. So thank you for that. Now, besides thanking him, there are many hands and legs which I would want to thank on behalf of the department, right? And of course, institutions. First and foremost, the Campus Lecture Series Committee, and secondly, SGSR, Campus Research Awards Funds. Those two actually assisted us with the funding side of this public lecture and the conference which will take place tomorrow and Thursday. I would also like to thank the Educational Media Services. As you can see, they're quite busy here, recording and whatnot for the sake of posterity. I would also like to mention the Solutions Center for giving us the venue, this beautiful place. And of course, from tomorrow, we'll be at the Solutions Center up to Friday. I cannot forget to mention campus security for securing our security. Right? We are very safe in here. And I would like to mention Miss Shelley Braithwaite, the administrative assistant of the department, who has been working more than 24 hours a day to see that everything takes place. So Shelley, thank you, but it's only the beginning. There's still tomorrow and Friday. I would also like to mention Ms. Alison Johnson of the faculty office. She's always been with us in spirit and giving advice. I would also like to thank each and every one of you for attending. So please give yourself a clap. Had Bewaji found himself here alone, he would have had to fly back to Jamaica. So thank you for coming. I'd also like to thank Mr. Gibbons and his team. You can see he's busy there, waiting for you, so that immediately I release you, you should go and he'll take care of your catering needs. Soft drinks, right? And I would also like, lastly but not least, to mention Roxanne Barton and Ed Brandon. They've taught me so many things, to do so many things online. Right? So thank you. And with that, you are all invited to have one or two things as you continue the discussion. Thank you.